Hi there, church family. Yeah, I'd like to remind you before I get a little carried away here that I said at the beginning that on Wednesday nights I wasn't doing theology, I wasn't doing Bible study. I was just sharing some things, challenging things that I have learned during my years in the ministry that have been helpful to me. They may not be helpful to you. I may be wrong. So if I say something a little bit controversial, if you disagree, listen to me, and then formulate your opinion, and that's fine if you disagree. I'm going to remind you of that this week because I'm going to get perhaps a little bit controversial right now. So I don't make this wrong, let me read this. The First Amendment to our Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition government for a redress of grievances. Now, it was back in 1635, before that was ever written, that Roger Williams first came up with the idea, the slogan of a wall of separation between church and state. But in 1802, Thomas Jefferson took that idea and wrote about a wall of separation between church and state, referring to the non-establishment amendment, the First Amendment of the Constitution, and wrote to a Baptist church using that phrase. Then it was in 1947 that the Supreme Court patterned and looked at Thomas Jefferson's writing and compared it to the First Amendment and made a statement about the Establishment Clause, which has become kind of the law of the land and regulates a lot of what we do nowadays. Okay, here's the controversial part, and you can decide what you want to do with it. I want to say that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are not Scripture. And Thomas Jefferson was no prophet. And that while I see good in there, and I'm certainly glad for our freedom to say our freedom of speech and freedom of religion, I see some problems in there that I don't think theologically can hold water. Has that got you interested? Yeah, listen on. Hear what I have to say before you throw rocks at me. When I was young, the church, that is the entire denomination that I grew up in, had a disagreement about several things on what it meant to be holy. Now, among other things in that disagreement were kitchens. There were those that believed that it was okay to have kitchens in the church, and there were those that thought that kitchens were rather profane or common, and they shouldn't be part of the church. The church should be set aside as a place for worship. And there were some parts of the country where that disagreement was, it might seem strange if you're not a part of our denomination at that time period, but where that conversation became so strained that a number of churches kind of split off on their own and formed their own small denomination. Now, I have no idea whatever became of that denomination, but when I was in college, I was gifted a series of denominational yearbooks that were once owned by one of our bishops in our denomination. And during the time period of this disagreement, the bishop scribbled several things in the margins of those yearbooks that had to do with that issue. And for me, it was like seeing a piece of history. Well, my mother probably would have come down on the, I don't think it's a probably, sure, certainly would have come down on the side that people should not eat in church, that there should be fellowship halls separated, for that. And yet, the first church plant I was part of was so small it didn't have fellowship halls for a while, and people had boards under the pews, and whenever there was a potluck right after church, they just flop the boards over, lay them across the pews, and make tables out of them to serve the food on. Now, well, I got to say that although I gained a lot from Mom, she probably would be rolling over in her grave right now if she knew that I probably kind of lean toward the idea that it's okay to eat in the church. Is that a shocker? Well, probably not, unless you are part of my home denomination and watched me grow up, and unless you knew my mom. Well, before you go out and string me up and say a lot of nasty things about me, hear me on out. Here I am, just sort of chilling. Yep, this is a dangerous chair here. This arm pops up, and it's got vibrators in the chair. It's got a heater in the chair. Got a soda on the table next to the chair. Yep, this is a place that I could just kind of pass out. Which also brings me to a kind of a controversial question. I mentioned earlier that I went through periods of time where I was just pretty high strung. Some people think you have to be high strung and doing something profitable at just about every minute of the day, or else you're wasting minutes. If you take time just to take a leisurely walk or exercise a little bit or watch a sunrise or watch a sunset, they think you're not being profitable. You're wasting time. And time wasted is time lost. I sort of disagree with that. Let me tell you why. I'm just sort of playing today and trying to be a little controversial, but sometimes a person can be controversial without even trying to be controversial. I remember a number of years ago, I was teaching at Lincoln Land Community College in the philosophy and humanities department, as I always do. And we had this spatial event in a local high school gymnasium. Not just Lincoln Land, but it was a whole community type of event. And we had a booth there. And they asked me if I would present something. I'd been teaching some night astronomy courses. They asked me if I would present something on astronomy theme. We had a drawing for a pair of binoculars, a free pair of binoculars. I had a telescope there and just answer whatever questions people had. And this fairly conservatively dressed lady came up to my display, and I greeted her and thought we were looking for, headed toward a nice conversation, until she opened her mouth. Evidently, I was an atheist of the worst sort that was pulling people away from God and teaching them about the evils of science rather than faith, and it took me off guard. I had not been attacked. I have been a few times, but very seldom attacked quite like that for doing something that was quite so harmless as just sitting behind a display table. Well, a few years later, I was at I was at Spoon River, where I'm at. I was teaching at all three, but I was at Spoon River, and we were offering a night astronomy course and showing planets and stuff through the telescope. And I had some pictures, and one particular picture I'd taken here in Raceville was of the moon, full moon rising, with the in the background with the Presbyterian Church's steeple and their cross in the foreground. I really liked that picture, and one of the persons that was there for that night saw that picture and kind of laughed. He had studied physics and thought it was so interesting and ironic that I would have a symbol of faith at a scientific type of event. Well, I'm going to say that both of those people, I know that people argue about faith and science, but those are not incompatible. One of my close friends who was an atheist gave me a book about Christian faith, written by a Catholic monk who is also one of the major scientists and studies meteorites and stuff. I had an interest in it, and it's called Brother Faith or something like that. And he gave it to me because I was a person of both faith and I enjoyed science at the same time, along with many other things. So, well, that kind of matches with everything else I've had here, something I want to say. Before I go into what my lesson was, I mean, my lesson that I learned in life was not just any one of these things. But before I do that, I want to look up the definition of two words. I want to look up the word sacred and the word secular. And if you let me show you the definitions of those two words, then I'll get to the point. I'm just kind of feeding the interest a little bit here, but I'll get to the point of what I really want to say. So listen to these two words, sacred and secular. Okay, if you'll put up with me just a little bit, let's look at this word sacred, an adjective, holy, hallowed, blessed, connected with God or the gods, dedicated to a religious purpose and so deserving veneration. Religious rather than secular. Okay, let's look up secular. Secular. Denoting attitudes, another adjective, denoting attitudes, activities, and other things that have no religious or spiritual basis, such as secular buildings. And then other definitions. Okay. You can tell I've been horsing around a little bit this week. You can tell that I've been just sort of playing with these different things. And the $64,000 question is, what do all of these things have in common, and what do they have in common with diet and exercise? Because in my lessons learned, a little journal for myself that I added to year by year by year as a pastor, my weakness wasn't politics so much, and it wasn't so much kitchens and churches. It was diet and exercise. And the thought that I was too busy. I had too much to do. I still battle that. I mentioned that last week in our thing, as we shared together, that I tend to think this is more important than this. This is sacred. This is some spiritual. This is not. This is secular. And I've grown to realize that there actually is no such thing as secular. See, we as Americans, we kind of cut everything up and stick it in little categories. So I can be a Christian on Sunday, but that doesn't necessarily affect how I have to work in my job on Monday. I might be a Christian at home, but then at school or with my friends, it goes out the window. Or I might come and repent for my sins on weekends and special services and just live however I want during the week. Or I might be, my politics might be pretty earthy, while my faith is supposed to be pretty high and sacred. Well, God is the God of the physical universe. God is the God of science. God is the God of creation. God is the God of, there isn't anything that God's not God of. And everything we do, every minute we spend, every breath we take needs to be set aside for God. And we need to see that our relaxation is a spiritual exercise. That our diet and what we stuff in our mouth is a spiritual exercise. That the things that come slipping and sliding out of our mouths on the weekdays is a spiritual exercise. That there isn't sacred and profane. That the moment we start putting those little categories in, the moment we start saying there are some things that are in the secular world and some things that are in the sacred world, it is a moment that we take God out of part of the world. We take God out of politics. We take God out of science. We take God out of all sorts of things, and in the process pretty much act as if God is a fairy tale that is just there for when we have a spiritual crisis or we want to have a spiritual warm, fuzzy feel. This is Wednesday. This is the God of Sunday is the God of today too. Have you been living like it?